The amber glow of studio lights bathed the sleek set of Evening Spotlight, where Fiona Carrington held court with her trademark caustic wit. Known for her razor-sharp commentary and unapologetically progressive stance, Fiona had carved out a formidable niche in late-night television, becoming the voice that viewers tuned in nightly to watch as she artfully dismantled guests with clever quips and unflinching sarcasm. Her audience adored her fearless approach, reveling in her ability to expose what she perceived as outdated ideologies with surgical precision. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us create more content like this. During a routine production meeting, her executive producer casually suggested, "What about inviting Clint Eastwood?" The room instantly buzzed with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Clint, a Hollywood legend whose gravitas was undeniable, had become a polarizing figure in recent years. His iconic roles in gritty westerns and powerful dramas were, in some circles, overshadowed by his outspoken conservative viewpoints. Fiona's eyes lit up with predatory gleam. "Perfect," she purred, already imagining the ratings boost and viral clips that would inevitably follow. This wasn't just another interview. It was an opportunity to expose what she considered outdated ideals embodied by the aging icon. In her mind, juxtaposing her cutting-edge modernity against Clint's traditional worldview would create television gold. With characteristic thoroughness, Fiona immersed herself in preparation. Her laptop screen illuminated her face late into the night as she studied clips of Clint's films, interviews, and public appearances. She meticulously crafted questions designed to corner him, scribbling notes in the margins of her outline, occasionally smirking at particularly biting observations. Her vision was clear. This would be a showdown between progressive values and what she saw as a relic of America's past. Meanwhile, at his sprawling ranch in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat at his sun-drenched kitchen table, reading the invitation with measured consideration. His weathered hands held the letter while he sipped black coffee from a simple ceramic mug. Jack, his young assistant, hovered nearby, concern etched across his face. "Are you sure about this, Clint?" Jack asked, his voice laced with protective worry. Fiona Carrington isn't exactly known for her hospitality, especially not to someone with your, well, perspectives. Clint's face remained impassive, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hostile territory or not, a conversation's just a conversation," he replied, setting the letter down. "People can say what they want. Doesn't change the truth." Jack wasn't convinced. Having witnessed Fiona's interviews, he knew her talent for transforming guests into unwitting targets. "She's going to come after you, your politics, your films, probably even your age." Clint shrugged, his gaze drifting to the rolling hills outside his window. "Let her," he said simply. "Sometimes it's not about winning or losing. It's about showing up." In the days leading up to the interview, the contrast between host and guest couldn't have been starker. Fiona's team worked feverishly, crafting questions loaded with enough irony and wit to keep her audience howling with laughter. Each question was a carefully constructed trap, designed to expose what she perceived as the contradictions and outdated values in Clint's worldview. Clint, meanwhile, carried on with his daily routine as if nothing extraordinary awaited him. He declined opportunities to rehearse responses or strategize defenses, preferring instead to trust his instincts and experience to guide him through whatever confrontation lay ahead. The night of the show, the studio hummed with anticipatory energy. The audience, primarily composed of Fiona's loyal fans, filed in with expectations of witnessing their hero eviscerate another conservative figure. Backstage, Fiona ran through her opening monologue one final time, confidence radiating from her like heat from a furnace. In the quiet of the green room, Clint sat alone, sipping water and acknowledging crew members with polite nods. There was no tension in his posture, no hint of anxiety in his expression, just the calm assurance of a man who had nothing to prove. For Fiona, this was another opportunity to showcase her wit and reinforce her cultural relevance. For Clint, it was simply a chance to share his perspective with an audience that might otherwise never hear it. Neither could have predicted how profoundly the night would challenge assumptions, shift perceptions, and spark conversations that would echo far beyond the confines of a late-night talk show. As the studio lights dimmed momentarily before coming up full for the broadcast, two worlds prepared to collide, one fueled by sharp-tongued commentary aimed at exposing perceived failings, the other grounded in a quiet confidence born from decades of living according to deeply held principles. What followed would be more than entertainment. It would be a master class in authenticity. The studio lights blazed as Fiona Carrington strode onto the stage, greeted by thunderous applause from her devoted audience. Dressed in a sleek designer suit that embodied her modern aesthetic, she moved with the confident swagger of a prizefighter entering the ring. Her signature smile, sharp, knowing, and just a touch predatory, flashed beneath the studio lights as she launched into her opening monologue. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got quite a show for you tonight," she began, her voice resonating with practiced charm. "Our guest is someone who might need an introduction to some of our younger viewers. Yes, we have a living Hollywood fossil joining us." The audience erupted in laughter, emboldening her to continue. "Clint Eastwood, folks, an icon of old-school masculinity, star of countless westerns, and a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is a valid form of political discourse." The crowd roared with approval, some clapping enthusiastically, while others exchanged knowing glances. Backstage, Clint watched the monitor with mild amusement, his weathered face betraying neither offense nor concern. Jack shifted uncomfortably beside him. "She's really going for the jugular," Jack muttered, his protective instincts flaring. Clint shrugged, unperturbed. "She's playing to her crowd. That's her job." When Fiona finally introduced him, the applause was noticeably mixed, enthusiasm tempered by a scattering of polite, uncertain claps. Clint walked onto the stage with unhurried dignity, his tall frame still commanding, despite his advanced years. He tipped an imaginary hat to the audience, earning a few appreciative chuckles and surprising more than a few with his lack of apparent defensiveness. "Mr. Eastwood," Fiona began, leaning forward in her chair with predatory interest. "Welcome to Evening Spotlight. I have to say, it's not often we have someone of your vintage on the show." "Thanks for having me," Clint replied, his gravelly voice surprisingly gentle. "Nice crowd you've got here." Fiona wasted no time launching her offensive. "So Clint, may I call you Clint? You've had quite the career. Over 6 decades in Hollywood, which is impressive. But I'm curious, do you ever look around at the industry today and think maybe it's time to let the new generation take the reins?" The question was crafted to be the first jab in what she anticipated would be a verbal sparring match. The audience leaned forward, eager for blood. Clint considered the question, unhurried and thoughtful. "Well, Fiona," he said finally, "I've always believed work isn't about age. It's about whether you've got something worth saying or doing. Whether you're 25 or 94, if you've got a story to tell, why stop?" His calm response, devoid of defensiveness, caught Fiona momentarily off guard, but she quickly regrouped. "Fair enough, but times change, don't they? I mean, your early films, classics no doubt, but let's be honest, they're not exactly known for their progressive representation of women or minorities. Do you ever feel like those old-school values you portrayed just don't hold up anymore?" The audience tittered appreciatively, recognizing the trap she'd laid. Clint leaned back slightly, considering his words with care. "I think it's important to remember," he began, his voice steady, "that films reflect their time. They capture what people were thinking, feeling, struggling with. Sure, some of it doesn't age well, but that's true of anything in life. Progress means learning from the past, not erasing it." A murmur ran through the audience. Not quite the reaction Fiona had anticipated. She pressed on, determined to provoke the confrontation she'd envisioned. "Let's talk politics," she said, shifting tactics. "You've been pretty vocal about your views over the years, and let's just say they don't exactly align with, well, a lot of this audience." She gestured broadly, earning approving nods. "Do you ever worry that being so outspoken might alienate people who used to look up to you?" Clint met her gaze directly, unintimidated. "I've always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for. If that means some people don't like me, so be it. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about standing by your principles even when it's inconvenient." His response hung in the air, unexpectedly weighty. Several audience members shifted in their seats. the atmosphere in the studio subtly changing. Fiona felt a flicker of unease as she realized her barbs weren't eliciting the defensive reactions she'd anticipated. But don't you think that kind of stubbornness can come across as out of touch? She challenged, her voice taking on a tone of mock concern. I mean, the world's moving forward, and some might say you're clinging to the past. Clint chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You call it clinging, I call it staying grounded. The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes in its rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before. The studio fell momentarily silent, a rarity for Fiona's show. She glanced at her audience, disconcerted to see thoughtful expressions where she'd expected supportive smirks. This wasn't following the script she'd envisioned. Fair enough, she conceded, regrouping. But surely you can admit there's room for improvement in the way we used to do things. Of course, Clint replied without hesitation. There's always room for improvement, but improvement doesn't mean throwing away the foundation. It means building on it. You can't write a new chapter if you're too busy tearing out the old pages. His metaphor resonated unexpectedly, even with audience members who had arrived fully prepared to dismiss him. Fiona felt the momentum she'd carefully cultivated beginning to slip away. The dynamic she'd anticipated, her sharp wit exposing an out-of-touch relic, was evolving into something altogether different and decidedly less comfortable. As the segment continued, a pattern emerged. Fiona would launch pointed questions designed to corner or provoke, and Clint would respond with measured, thoughtful answers that betrayed neither defensiveness nor irritation. His calm demeanor and unassuming wisdom began to win over even the most skeptical members of the audience, not through confrontation, but through authentic engagement. By the time they reached the first commercial break, Fiona found herself in unfamiliar territory, struggling to maintain control of an interview that was rapidly transforming from the takedown she'd envisioned into a showcase for Clint's unexpectedly resonant perspectives. The audience, which had arrived primed for Bloodsport, now watched with a growing respect that transcended political differences. As the studio lights dimmed for the break, Fiona caught Clint's eye, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across her perfectly composed features. She had come prepared for combat, but Clint had chosen conversation instead, and in doing so, he had changed the rules of engagement entirely. When the studio lights blazed back to life after the commercial break, something subtle but significant had shifted in the atmosphere. The audience, initially so eager for Fiona's characteristic takedowns, now regarded Clint with newfound curiosity. Even Fiona's posture had changed almost imperceptibly. Her aggressive lean forward softened to something more attentive. "Let's talk about your journey in Hollywood," she said, opting for what she considered safer territory. "You weren't always the icon you are today. What was that like, struggling before you made it big?" It was intended as a gentle pivot, a way to reassert control over the conversation. What Fiona didn't anticipate was how Clint's response would transform the interview entirely. "Mind if I tell a story?" Clint asked, his weathered face thoughtful. Fiona hesitated, then nodded, momentarily relinquishing the reins. "Go ahead." Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a quality that immediately commanded attention. Not through volume or force, but through an authenticity that cut through the studio's artificial environment. "People look at success and think it must have been smooth sailing," he began, "but Hollywood isn't kind to anyone, especially not to a lanky kid with a bad haircut and a voice people said was too soft for the screen." A gentle ripple of laughter moved through the audience, surprising Fiona with its warmth. "When I first got to Hollywood, I was nobody," Clint continued. "I took odd jobs, construction, driving trucks, anything to make ends meet. I got my first acting job as an extra, and let me tell you, I was awful." His self-deprecation caught the audience off guard, earning appreciative chuckles. "I'd get called out for wooden delivery, that awkward smile I couldn't seem to fix. One casting director told me flat out, 'Kid, you're never going to make it. You don't have the face or the talent.'" The studio had fallen completely silent, every person hanging on his words. Fiona, who had prepared to maintain the upper hand throughout the interview, found herself as captivated as her audience. "I could have quit," Clint said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Most people would have, but I didn't. Not because I thought I'd make it big, but because something inside me said keep going. I worked harder, learned from every mistake, every rejection. I studied people, how they walked, talked, carried themselves. And when the roles didn't come, I didn't sit around waiting. I built furniture, taught myself to work with my hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me going. His voice carried a weight that made his experiences feel immediate and raw, not just stories from a distant past. And then one day I got lucky, he continued, a faint smile crossing his lips. A small studio needed someone to play a cowboy. They didn't think much of me, but I had the right look and the right price. They didn't have to pay me much. His self-deprecating honesty earned another gentle laugh from the audience. That's how I landed Rawhide. It wasn't a big deal at the time, just another TV show, but for me, it was everything. A chance to prove I could do this. So I gave it my all. Fiona, who had planned to interject with another question, found herself unable to interrupt. There was a sincerity in Clint's voice that had disarmed her usual defenses. The funny thing about opportunities, Clint said, is they don't come with guarantees. You get your shot, and it's up to you what you do with it. I worked harder than I ever had, not because I wanted fame or money, but because I wanted to respect the chance I'd been given. And slowly things started to change. I learned, I grew, I got better. The audience was utterly captivated, their earlier jeers and laughter replaced by a quiet reverence. Even Fiona found herself leaning closer, her sharp wit momentarily forgotten. But Hollywood, Clint continued, his tone deepening, it tests you. Success doesn't mean the challenges stop. If anything, they get harder. People try to shape you, tell you what you can and can't do. I had to fight to stay true to myself. There were times when I turned down roles because they didn't feel right, even when I needed the money. I wasn't interested in being someone else's idea of a star. I just wanted to do good work and be honest about who I was. He looked out at the audience, his expression calm but firm. And you know what I learned through all of it? Integrity isn't about the big moments. It's about the small ones. The times when no one's watching and you still do the right thing. The times when you choose the hard road because it's the right one. That's what's kept me going all these years. A young man in the crowd nodded, his face thoughtful. A middle-aged woman in the front row wiped her eyes discreetly. Clint's words weren't just a recounting of his life. They were a mirror reflecting struggles and decisions that resonated with everyone in the room. Fiona cleared her throat, her voice quieter than usual. That's quite a journey, she said, the edge in her tone noticeably absent. But surely there were times you doubted yourself? Times when you wanted to give up? Clint nodded, his face softening. Of course. Everyone has doubts, Fiona. But the thing is, doubt is just part of the process. It's not a sign to stop. It's a sign to keep going. And if you stay true to yourself, the path becomes clear, even if it's not easy. The studio was silent, the weight of Clint's words settling over the room like a warm blanket. Fiona leaned back in her chair, for the first time unsure of what to say next. Clint had managed to do something remarkable. He'd taken a stage set for confrontation and turned it into a space for reflection and connection. As the segment ended and the camera crew signaled for another commercial break, the audience erupted in applause. Not the polite kind that followed Fiona's monologues, but the genuine, heartfelt kind reserved for moments that truly mattered. Clint, ever humble, gave a small nod and smiled faintly. For Fiona, a realization was beginning to dawn. This wasn't going to be the takedown she had envisioned. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an old actor with outdated ideas. He was a man who had lived through battles both on screen and off, and emerged with a wisdom that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. As the lights dimmed for the break, she found herself reconsidering not just her approach to the interview, but her entire perspective on what it meant to engage with those whose views differed from her own. When the studio lights brightened again, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The audience that had arrived expecting entertainment through confrontation now sat in attentive silence, their expressions thoughtful and engaged. Fiona, whose career had been built on sharp comebacks and clever dismissals, found herself approaching the final segment with an unfamiliar humility. Clint, she began, her voice gentler than before, You've spoken about resilience and staying true to yourself, but I'm curious. In a world that's so divided, how do you navigate the criticism? You've faced plenty of it, especially for your political views. The question lacked her usual barbs, reflecting a genuine curiosity that surprised even her. Clint considered her words, his calm demeanor unchanged. It's easy to get caught up in the noise, he said finally. The world is loud these days. Opinions everywhere. People shouting to be heard. But the truth is usually found in the quiet moments, when no one's looking. The audience was utterly still, captivated by the weight of his words. Fiona, usually quick with a witty retort, found herself pausing, letting his statement sink in. I've been in a lot of noisy rooms, Clint continued, his voice low and steady. Hollywood parties, film sets, political debates. And you know what I've learned? Noise doesn't mean substance. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one you should listen to. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who have the most to say. Fiona shifted in her chair, the weight of his words settling over her. For years, she had thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, using her platform to amplify her opinions and challenge those who disagreed. But now, sitting across from Clint Eastwood, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was she truly listening, or was she just waiting for her turn to speak? So, Clint, she said after a pause, her voice softer than usual, do you think the world's gotten too noisy? Too divided? Clint smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. I think the world's always been divided, Fiona. We just hear more of it now because of technology, social media, 24-hour news. Everyone's got a platform, and everyone's talking. But the question isn't about the noise. It's about what you do with it. Are you adding to the chaos, or are you trying to make sense of it? The audience murmured softly, their earlier energy replaced by a thoughtful stillness. Clint's words weren't just landing, they were resonating on a level that transcended political differences. And what about you? Fiona asked, her curiosity genuine now. How do you handle the noise? You've been criticized for your views, your films, even your age. How do you deal with all of that? Clint's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost wistful. You don't let it in, he said simply. The world can say what it wants about you, but at the end of the day, it's your own voice that matters most. If you start letting other people's opinions define you, you lose yourself. And once you lose yourself, it's hard to get back. A young woman in the front row wiped away a tear, her face reflecting a mix of admiration and introspection. A middle-aged man in the back nodded solemnly, his arms crossed as he stared at the stage. The audience, once boisterous and quick to laugh at Fiona's sharp jabs, now seemed humbled, their expressions reflective. Fiona glanced at her notes, but they suddenly felt irrelevant. She closed the folder quietly and leaned forward, her eyes meeting Clint's. You've lived through a lot of different eras, she said. Hollywood has changed. The world has changed. Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Clint took a moment to think, his gaze steady. I think progress is important, he said, but progress without reflection can be dangerous. You have to know where you've been to understand where you're going. And sometimes in our rush to move forward, we forget to look back and learn from the past. The studio was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the cameras. Fiona, usually so quick to steer the conversation, let the moment linger. The audience seemed mesmerized, caught in the gravity of Clint's words. Look, Clint added, his voice firm but kind, I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their life, but I will say this. Don't let the noise drown out your own voice. Don't let the world rush you into decisions you're not ready to make. And don't be afraid to stand still for a moment, to think, to feel, to listen. That's where you'll find clarity. The applause started softly, almost hesitantly, before building into something louder and more genuine. It wasn't the raucous cheer of an audience entertained. It was the heartfelt response of people moved by something real. Fiona sat back, her expression thoughtful as she watched the crowd. As the clapping subsided, Fiona turned back to Clint. I'll be honest, she said, her tone quieter than usual. I came into this interview thinking I'd be the one asking all the tough questions, but you've made me think about some things I didn't expect to. Clint smiled faintly. That's the beauty of a good conversation, he said. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning. The camera panned to the audience, capturing their expressions, some smiling, some wiping their eyes, others sitting in quiet contemplation. The energy in the room had shifted completely, transformed by Clint's quiet power and the undeniable truth of his words. As the show came to a close, and Clint left the stage to warm, respectful applause, Fiona found herself sitting alone at her desk, the weight of the evening's unexpected turn settling over her. What had begun as an attempt to showcase her wit at the expense of an aging Hollywood icon had become something profoundly different, a lesson in integrity, authenticity, and the power of genuine dialogue. In the days that followed, clips from the interview went viral, not for the expected confrontation, but for the wisdom Clint had shared. People across political divides found themselves sharing his words, discussing the value of staying true to oneself in a world dominated by noise and division. The phrase integrity isn't about being popular, it's about living with yourself became a touchstone, repeated in conversations from boardrooms to classrooms. For Fiona, the interview marked a turning point. She began approaching her shows differently, less focused on clever takedowns and more interested in genuine exchanges. Her ratings didn't suffer. If anything, they improved as viewers responded to the authentic conversations that emerged when she truly listened to her guests, regardless of their political leanings. And for Clint, he returned to his ranch unperturbed by the buzz surrounding the interview. He had simply spoken his truth, as he always had, with no expectation beyond being heard. The fact that his words had resonated so deeply was, to him, just a testament to the enduring power of authenticity in a world increasingly hungry for something real. In the end, what had begun as an attempted mockery had become a masterclass, not just in resilience or integrity, but in the transformative potential of genuine dialogue across the divides that too often separate us. It was a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths, and that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places, if only we're willing to truly listen.